During the Great Patriotic War, we captured more than 400 of Wehrmacht generals. It was a whole general's battalion. Registration files of many of them are now still kept here in the former Special Archives in Moscow. A tragic zigzag of human fate and a drama of history at the same time are behind each of these files. February 1943. Just then, our forces captured the first group of Wehrmacht generals, headed by Field Marshal Paulus in the Battle of Stalingrad. 90,000 of soldiers and officers were captured along with them.
I acted as a commandant of the German generals' camp.
Lev Alexandrovich Bezimenskaya, Doctor of Historical Sciences, Professor, Military Interpreter in the past.
Since the 28th, the captured generals arrived in the village Zverykino one after another. One, another, until there were 22 of them.
Stalingrad Army Group Commander-in-Chief Field Marshal Paulus and Chief of his headquarters, Lieutenant General Schmidt, were delivered to the Army headquarters for the first interrogation.
We entered the entrance room and Paulus asked me, "How will I understand who is there?" I explained that Artillery Colonel General, Artillery Marshal in after years, Voronov, and Army Group Commander-in-Chief Rokossovsky will be present there. Paulus, entering the room, greeted the Soviet generals with "Heil," evidently in the quite mechanical way. I grew cold for thinking, God, what will happen now? But nothing happened, for Voronov and Rokossovsky were probably strained much by unusual situation. Soviet generals were about to interrogate the German field marshal for the first time in life, so they did not notice his greeting. The conversation began. This conversation cannot be called as interrogation. Voronov was aimed to make Paulus to give a command to stop the resistance to those soldiers continuing it yet. The so-called North Boiler was still fighting. Paulus refused, saying, first of all, he is a prisoner and cannot give commands to his soldiers. Second, if he gives such command, they think he is acting under compulsion. In general, one way or another, he answered, no, no, and no.
Soon the captured generals were transported from Stalingrad to the hinterland in the environs of Moscow. They were temporarily located in the camp number 27, which was on the outskirts of Krasnogorsk.
The huts for the prisoners of war were located there. Paulus's house was located somewhat higher, at the very Piedmont. Officer's hut was located nearby, lower a little. The huts of other prisoners of war stretched up to a lake. The generals arrived. Most of them were obvious enemies of the Soviet regime, Soviet Union. They were our open foes.
Arkadia Anasimovich Krupenikov, candidate of Historical Sciences, director of German Anti-Fascist Memorial Museum, veteran of the Great Pacific War.
It was not an easy task to work with them, for some of them remained completely devoted to the Führer.
The generals did not stay at Krasnogorsk camp for a long time. In the spring of 1942, they were transferred to Suzdal and located in the cells of the former Spaso Yefimyevo monastery. This monastery was converted in the political prison, reported to be one of the gloomiest of those in Stalin's Gulag, as long ago as the beginnings of the 1940s. By the time of the general's arrival, the former monastery had been already placed under the jurisdiction of the Central Administrative Board of Prisoners of War and Internees, or in abbreviated form, the CAB-PWI, which formed a part of the People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs. Naturally, the captured enemy soldiers and officers were under investigation of military intelligence services at first, and then they were sent to the camps and prisons of the NKVD, the People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs. After Stalingrad, the number of prisoners of war increased greatly in our camps. Many of them, first of all soldiers, have already been tired of war and disposed to anti-fascism. Our political leadership considered that these prisoners of war in particular can influence their compatriots located at other sides of the front line and help us in the fulfillment of the propagandist war against Hitler. To realize it, the prisoners of war should have had their own anti-fascist organization, mass and capable of functioning enough through our own control in full. This organization, named National Committee Free Germany, was created at the Prisoners' War Conference, which took place at Krasnogorsk in July 1943.
Well, at this conference in Krasnogorsk, mainly junior officers and soldiers, non-commissioned officers, gathered at the conference, and the most senior rank consisted of the majors. When the National Committee Free Germany was created and a newspaper, Free Deutschland, was started to issue, the German side and we realized the committee had not yet the sufficient influence on the German army and the population due to the fact that there are no generals and prominent persons in its staff. One should know the German people. They reckon with authorities of special kind, particularly in the military respect, and the general is a figure. The generals were not yet ready for the creation of this committee, Free Germany. They did not grow enough for it. Insomuch as we were engaged in the demoralization of the enemy army to decrease our losses and facilitate the war progress and end, the captured should have played their part and be worth their salt.
Yakov Samoilovich Dromkin, Doctor of Historical Sciences, Professor, former political officer, veteran of the Great Patriotic War.
The officers and generals should not have worked in accordance with the Geneva Covenants. They should have been fed and had batmen of the prisoners of war. Often these were their own batmen, soldiers or officers, which went the military way together with them. And in general, we were waiting for the end of the war. Certainly it was possible to allow them to eat our bread, which was so precious at that time for our own people.
On December 1943, the generals had to move to a new place again. This time it was a special generals camp in Chernsty, a village of Ivanovo Oblast. It was considered that it would be easier to provide a required maintenance procedure as well as propagandistic, operative work with a highly specific generals committee. Naturally, special requirements were made to the camp personnel.
I was at the Northwest Front. I worked as a hospital nurse in the military hospital.
Tatiana Vasilyevna Motova, veteran of the Great Patriotic War.
My father worked at Northwest Front as well, in the Department of Sanitation. He was proposed to be a head of this camp sanitation department. He was asked whether his acquaintances had a sister knowing German. He said he knew nothing of such sister, but his daughter has graduated the historical department of Moscow University and spoke German and French. Furthermore, she has graduated the obstetric and doctor's assistant technical school. I was called in Moscow in the Department of Prisons of War and Internees.
И там провели со мной беседу на знание языка, вообще на общее
I was
развитие,
interviewed on the
на
language knowledge,
медицинские темы.
general intelligence, medical subjects, and confirmed as a nurse.
Утвердили меня медсестрой.
It was in 1949 in Chernsty village. To protect this camp, it was considered as a state one, number 48, for his contingent consisted of the generals.
Gennady Petrovich Golovin, he served in the NKVD escort guard forces since 1944.
Outside guard, camp's territory was fenced with a wooden fence 3 meters high. There was a strip beginning from the inside of this fence. It was called 4-zone, fenced with barbed wire. The same strip fenced with barbed wire was outside, the 4-zone as well. There was no attempt to escape. One may say it was a well-bred contingent. The generals, for the most part, civilized people. They are far from our prisoners, which behave like a hooligan.
At the new place, the generals were in quite good, almost sanitary conditions, but by no means they were about to be left alone. It was necessary to get at least some of them properly to take part in the new purely officers' anti-fascist organization, Union of German Officers. Moreover, a leader of authority was necessary for this organization, such as Field Marshal Paulus.
Paulus was certainly a prominent figure among German generals. He was an outstanding figure among Hitler's higher military figures, as far back as prior to the war. It is sufficient to say that he took an active and direct part in the development of the Plan Barbarossa, i.e. of the plan to attack the Soviet Union. It says a great deal about him, and by no chance Paulus was in command of one of the strongest armies in the operation of 1942, i.e. in the attack of Volga. It was the 6th Army, so Paulus was a figure in this respect.
But at the time, Paulus remained completely faithful to Hitler. Referring to oath and soldier's duty, he definitely refused from any cooperation with the enemy. His colleague by 6th Army, Artillery General Walter von Seydlitz, provided to be a much more realistic candidate for the role of the leader of the anti-fascist movement.
Artillery General Walter von Seydlitz-Kurzbach was indeed an unusual figure in the history of anti-fascist movement. He deserves a special attention. He was born in 1888 in Hamburg, in a general's family, in the military environment, in other words. He chose a military career from the very childhood. He passed through all grades up to high rank. He distinguished himself greatly during the war with the Soviet Union. He was rewarded with both the Cross of Iron and the Officer's Cross. But it so happened in Stalingrad that he found himself together with others in the huge Stalingrad boiler. He was in command of the infantry corps there. He had to give himself up too on January 31st, 1943. But what characterizes Seydlitz, as a military man, he was at a proper level, but he did not perceive the Nazism as a dictatorship established in Germany. Seydlitz, taken as a prisoner, got used to his new situation rather quickly, although it was really a revolution in his perception, no doubt. He thought that he should take an active part in activities, which could help to end the war with honor for Germany.
Seidlitz' candidature was approved at the upper level. On September 1943, he was elected as the president of the Union of German Officers at the constituent conference of this organization. Soon afterwards, he became a vice president of the National Committee, Free Germany.
Seidlitz, for participation in the activities of the Union of German Officers and National Committee Free Germany, was convicted and sentenced by Nazi authorities to the death penalty as a traitor and betrayer. Attitude towards Seidlitz was complicated among his friends and other prisoners of war, generals, colonels, etc. Some people supported his activities in full. Others continued to consider him as a traitor.
However, many generals tried not to be involved in politics, preferring to remain just prisoners of war, although very privileged ones.
This building contained the household premises, shoe workshop, laundry, baths. All of these were located in this building. Once there was a greenhouse on this side of the facade. One of the generals looked after it and grew fresh vegetables. This is here near this building, and that building is the residential facilities. By the way, Paulus lived in this building as well.
We worked with Paulus in educational field, no interrogations on purpose, just to cheer him up.
Marina Ivanovna Karina, NKVD operative during the Great Patriotic War.
He had very good conditions, a large room. His adjutant retained a grand piano. Nobody was made such concessions. He had his own cook. He had no idea about our regime, Soviets, how we live in general. We had to present him even the political basic principles. He was a tall person, up to 2 meters, about 1 meter and 94, 95. He was thin to an unbelievable extent. It is clear, of course, he lost 300,000 of his soldiers. One might say he lost everything in his life, but he behaved with great dignity, very great dignity. Once we managed to receive a letter from his wife to him. My friend who was working with me handed this letter over to him. Other men would text the letter immediately to open and read it. He thanked with great calm and put the letter in his pocket. He was very self-possessed, a great self-control. Well, to bring him to healthy form, it was decided that he needed this special nourishment. My father proposed it to him and asked about his taste. He said, "I will eat the same food as my soldiers do." He had in mind not only soldiers, but the generals as well.
There is an entrance on this side, the door, 2 windows. There was a bakery along the facade and a kitchen farther.
Cooks were Italian and German. My father developed a menu in accordance with ration allowance. The bread was white and black. A bakery was our own. Meat was an obligatory part of the dinner. Certainly there were porridges, potatoes, all sorts of vegetables. Household plot was managed very well. The generals usually saved some amount of dried fruits, fats, for holidays, Christmas especially. There was a confectioner, Carrero, Italian, who baked the excellent cakes. The nourishment was very good. Neither me nor my children ate as the generals, at any case.
The generals were fed better for different reasons. At first, due to respect the likes in our leaders. At second, this was a common practice. The same in all the Union Army. Of course, they were maintained in the hope that they would play their part in the course of the war. And some people thought that after the war it would be better to have not enemies, but perhaps allies.
Sure, good nourishment was sometimes in those conditions, much more efficient than those skilled propaganda. It was no wonder that the activists of the anti-fascist movement were often accused of selling Bolsheviks for the supplementary rations. However, these accusations were groundless completely. Seidlitz and his colleagues from the Union of German Officers worked, as they say, with total dedication. They did it by no means for their sake of their daily bread. Nevertheless, the victories of the Soviet Army on the fronts were as main arguments in the struggle for the generals' souls. German anti-fascists carried out their own war against Hitler.
At first, Seidlitz was active. He knew many German generals, many people with whom he was at war, studied or served. His addresses to them were often with name. He wrote the leaflets addressed to soldiers, officers, generals of specific division, and visited the fronts. In particular, his trip to the Northwest Front was very outstanding. Several of ours, I'm sorry, of officers, activists in the Union of German Officers were with him. They issued the leaflets there and dropped them from airplanes by means of mortars and guns, special propaganda shells. The shell with the leaflets flew and blew up above the enemy's positions, and the leaflets flew instead of splinters. They went to the front line directly and urged to surrender by radio. They used other methods as well. Naturally, the participation of the generals and senior officers in addresses to the German army at the other side of the front was more efficient than those of soldiers and lance corporals which knew their units. It was very important indeed. They addressed a commander directly, explained that they were in captivity. It was possible to live there, no reason to continue the resistance, and it would be better to surrender. When the generals and officers took their part in it, it had not only local character, but a common political one, as it undermined the positions of Wehrmacht leadership, i.e. the Nazis' positions, Hitler's positions.
It was the fourth year of the war. The front moved implacably to the west, and endless columns of prisoners moved to the east. Meanwhile, the life in the general's camp in Chernsky went on its own way.
There was an outhouse at this place, oval two-story premises. A dining room was downstairs. The upper story contained a club. There were club premises and a library. Sometimes we demonstrated the movies.
They went to the club to watch movies with pleasure. We demonstrated everything.
In the environs of Minsk, Major General Clement, a commander of the 260th Infantry Division, gave himself up to our forces. Other hero of Minsk defeat, General Felders, a commander of the 27th Army German Corps.
When the capture and march of prisoners through Moscow was shown, General Engel went in front. And everybody shouted, "Engel, Engel, look, you go." He stood up and smiled. Such a reaction.
In the summer of 1944, in the course of Bagration operation, our army crushed a large enemy's force in the Belarus and captured thousands of soldiers and officers, including tens of generals.
Then the generals gave themselves up, as I have already observed, in shoals.
Yakov Samoilovich Drankin, Doctor of Historical Sciences, professor, a former political official, veteran of the Great Patriotic War.
I had the occasion to meet such generals in the environs of Mogilev, somewhat farther away. I remember two of them quite well. I was an instructor in charge of literature on this work in the Army Squad of the 11th Army. General Müller, Vinces Müller. This general, after the short conversation and explanation that his situation is hopeless and a request to save his soldiers, agreed to write an address and even an order to his army about weapons and people surrender.
Now the way of the generals was to the village of Chernsky of Ivanovsky district in Camp Number 48, where their colleagues from the 6th Army and the Wehrmacht were camped for more than a year, headed by Field Marshal Paulus.
How did I speak with Paulus? I spoke with him in French.
Tatiana Vasilievna Motova, a former nurse of the Camp 48.
I was embarrassed to speak with him in German. I did not know it to perfection. I am able to speak, of course, on the subjects of everyday life reasonably well, but I speak French better. Perhaps Paulus knew French at my level, so we communicated with him well in French.
To start with, almost all of them could already speak Russian.
Gennady Petrovich Golovin. He served in the NKVD escort guard forces since 1944.
Some of them were so stubborn that they did not want to learn Russian, but they understood Russian well for the most part.
My husband knew German very well. He worked as an interpreter and was called from the front to teach the Germans Russian. Now I can say that my husband was not only an interpreter, but operative as well.
Operative work was not arranged as a special function. Operative service, special personnel which fulfilled its duties on a daily basis. In other words, those wanted were invited in the headquarters for conversation. But a subject of conversation, it is their business.
Once intelligence service reported that one of the generals kept the potassium cyanide in this ring. It was decided to seize his ring. He was called to operative department and said openly that he had a ring with potassium cyanide. Give it to avoid the troubles. He brought this ring. It had a closing sealing part, and when it was opened, the potassium cyanide was really there.
A colleague watched by nights and days, listening specially. But after all, the equipment was not perfect at that time. Now, of course, but at that time. But units were all the same. It is no secret. They knew it as well. Undoubtedly, they were careful of it.
There was a separate room. Usually 3 officers came who looked after this wiring. I don't know how it was, where it was, for the Germans dug up all plinths and everywhere, but found nothing. But the listening surveillance took place.
Work with Paulus required from the operatives a special non-standard approach. In the summer of 1944, the field marshal was removed from the general camp to one of the special NKVD villas situated near Moscow. There he kept a diary, drew, received guests. They created maximum comfort for him. Meanwhile, they did not leave attempts to persuade him of participation in the anti-fascist movement. At last, Paulus said yes after long-term doubts and reflections.
Paulus joined the movement only in 1944.
Arkady Anasimovich Kupinikov, candidate of Historical Sciences, director of German Anti-Fascist Memorial Museum, veteran of the Great Patriotic War.
In my opinion, he was influenced with three factors along with our propaganda, work with the generals, etc. Defeat of Group Center by the Soviet Army in the summer of 1944 in Belarus. Defeat of Group Center by Soviet Army in summer of 1944 in Belarus. Then the landing of the Union forces on July 6, 1944, and the fact of attempt at Hitler. In other words, the internal position of the generals, Colonel Stauffenberg. These three factors influeed upon him undoubtedly, along with this fact that he was imbued gradually with the sensation that it is necessary to dethrone Nazism, end the war until the old border was not reached. After all, an idea was in the following. You know, our Soviet propaganda and that of the National Committee, Union of German Officers, had their specifics and differences. We agitated for complete defeat of Nazism, liberation of German people from the fascism yoke, etc. But they agitated to get out of the war in order not to give completely, frankly speaking, to defeat Germany, so as to army was left, at least small, to stop the war at old borders.
The Soviet army was handily approaching the Reich borders, and Sedlitz came to the conclusion that it was time to switch from the propaganda to other more resolute activities. He proposed to form quickly German units of the prisoners of war and send them to the front to fight against Hitler.
He had many plans. At first it was a battalion, then up to 3 divisions, which he wanted to receive for this purpose. He wrote the reports to our authorities, including Stalin, but they did not agree to it on the different reasons. Now I cannot explain all the motives. Among other reasons, it was because it would drive us in difficult situations to our allies, for there were Geneva Conventions which prohibited to arm and use the prisoners of war for their own purposes. And the other reasons? Perhaps absence of the confidence.
I was on duty on May 2nd. Telephonist on duty at Cherncy post office called me. I heard her words. Tanya, Berlin is captured. I called by phone to the commandant of the camp and said, Vladimir Stepanovich, Berlin is captured. It was announced by radio. I was informed by Cherncy post office. Will you come to inform the generals? He says, I think it would be better if you tell them. You are a woman and frontline soldier. Go and tell them that Berlin was captured. I went. I said, Messrs. Generals, Berlin is captured. They made a fuss. Went in other rooms. I went to the medical unit. It was a coincidence that I was on duty from 8th to 9th. Do you see? This telephonist called me again.
на 9-е, понимаете? И
I
опять мне
called the commander
позвонила
again,
эта
and he said
телефонистка,
again.
и опять я звонила
Well, he told them about
начальнику,
Berlin,
и опять начальник сказал,
so
ну раз
go and
ты
tell them
Берлин
about
объявила, иди
capitulation.
капитуляцию объяви. Я пошла опять в эту комнату, опять с этим
I went
старшим
again to this room
ординарцем
with
и
senior
говорю,
orderly and
господа
said, Messrs.
генералы,
Generals, Germany capitulated. All of them
они
stood up
все
as at the
встали,
funeral.
как
That's
на
all.
похоронах. Все, вот так.
Когда война закончилась и она почти сразу
When the
переросла
war
в,
was
как
ended,
вы
you
знаете,
know, it
в
developed into the
войну
Cold War almost immediately. Our relations
наши
with the
отношения с
Allies
союзниками
intensified.
обострились, то генералы, которые
The generals and a
оставались
large
у нас
amount
в
of
плену, и
officers in our
офицеров большое
captivity
количество,
served as
это
a
был
sort
тоже
of political
своего
trump
рода
card in our
политический
relations
код
with New Germany,
в наших отношениях и с Новой Германией,
both with
или
two
с двумя
created German states and our
формировавшимися
allies.
германскими государствами и с нашими союзниками.
On July 1945, a conference of states, winners, was opened in Potsdam, the suburb of Berlin. Among other questions on post-war arrangement of Europe, the fast repatriation of prisoners of war was discussed there as well. Following the Potsdam decisions, the USSR government began to gradually release the German prisoners home. They were soldiers and junior officers for the most part. However, it was not done without the great politics. Those who were ready to go in the Soviet zone of occupation, territory of the German Democratic Republic, were released first of all. The intention to return to West Germany could be worthy of some additional years in the Soviet camps for a prisoner. As to generals, all of them, with rare exception, were remaining in captivity. However, their regular life experienced important changes.
We received a command for generals to remove shoulder straps, orders, and deliver them. It was fulfilled in the medical unit in case of any excess. If somebody delivered his crosses of iron, would require the medical assistance. A sheet was spread so touchingly. They put their orders there. They were counted up, what sort and how many, sealed up and sent to Moscow.
It was not very difficult to part with the regalia of the fascist Reich. To get even with its own past was a more difficult task. On November 20th, 1945, a trial of main Nazi criminals began in Nuremberg. The highest ranks of German army appeared before an international tribunal as well. On a twist of fate, the former colleague, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, called to give evidence by the Soviet Party, should testify against them. One may guess what a difficult ordeal was this trial for Paulus himself. Is your name Friedrich Paulus? Yes. Were you born in 1890? Accusations and military crimes were brought against many German generals located in Soviet captivity. In most cases, they had standard sentences, 25 years of imprisonment. It was remarkable that the same accusations, unsubstantiated absolutely, were brought against Walter von Seyditz, a leader of the Union of German Officers, disbanded by this. They certainly settled a score with him for excessive independence, censorious remarks about the Soviet system, firm wish to live in West Germany.
In these conditions, Seydlitz was in the most unfavorable state. He who participated actively from the very beginning in our common politics of overthrow of the Nazi regime now was under trial. And if in Germany he was sentenced to the death penalty for high treason, then our judges sentenced him to the death penalty, but changed immediately to a 25-year imprisonment. And he became a man sentenced to the death penalty both by Hitler and Stalin. Only recently the retrial of his case and complete political rehabilitation achieved the success. He was sentenced for nothing at a tide of repressive activities of our authorities, which sentenced right and left, innocent and guilty with the same energy. This self-made cigarette case belonged to Walter von Seydlitz. He was imprisoned in a Soviet prison. He was in Butyrskaya prison. Being there, he made this cigarette case. It is interesting. Look at the dates. Karl Hilpert died on February 1st, 1947. Hilpert died on January 30th, 1947, in the Butyrskaya prison. So happened that Krasnogorsky camp and his commander, Lieutenant Colonel Gusev, received a letter from the head of CAB-PWI, the Central Administrative Board of Prisoners of War and Internees, which asked to accept a body of the Colonel General Hilpert, who died in the Butyrskaya prison, register him in their hospital, the camp's hospital, and bury him at their cemetery in Krasnogorsk. So there is a mark on the document. Gusev, fulfilled on February 2nd, 1947. So the body was transported here from Butyrskaya prison and buried at this cemetery with indication that he died 2 days later than it was in reality. Perhaps the sense was that in the Butyrskaya prison, people are not dying, they die in the camps. Perhaps it was the sense. The funeral was modest if the deceased was not a very prominent one. Group of workers on a horse made a coffin and buried without fuss. Only one of them had a funeral procession. He perhaps had authority among them. So as they decided to carry out the procedure with more respect. They made a request to the commander of the camp. He gave permission. I provided for guard, only in a private way. Ambush at the cemetery. The soldiers were notified to take no liberties. They promised that everything would be okay. Perhaps more than 100 of attending people were there. The procession was going after the coffin through the entire cemetery. Returning to Seydlitz and Paulus, it is necessary to say that they got to complicated, a very difficult situation. They got between, on the one hand, their old ideas about German duty and criminal activities of the Führer and Nazi clique, which they admitted, were forced to admit, and admitted in the captivity only, not at large, and the way the history developed. Paulus was not a politician, but Seydlitz wanted to play a part in politics. Perhaps this is the most significant difference. That is why their fates were not the same. Paulus was a peculiar figure. Unlike Seydlitz, he joined the Soviet authority, the Soviet Union.
советских властей, Советского Союза, он как-то более...
He was more influenced and reckoned with our influence to a greater extent.
был воздействию и более,
He did not persist to be sent to West Germany.
И не настаивал, чтобы его отправили жить.
He knew that he would not be sent there, although he was from Kassel by origin.
Хотя родом он из Касселя, Кассель был в ФРГ. Вот.
Kassel was in the Federal Republic of Germany.
Даже в судьбе Зайдлица в какой-то мере...
Therefore, he influenced upon Seydlitz' fate to some extent. When he expressed his opinion about somewhat unbalanced character of Seydlitz, his potential to become inclined to West forces, West circles. He made such statement. He was planned to be released, repatriated in 1950 to the German Democratic Republic, but refrained. He went to Germany at the territory of the German Democratic Republic only in 1953. His last position in the service record, he worked as a consultant in Dresden at Military Academy of the German Democratic Republic.
In September 1955, the Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany, Konrad Adenauer, arrived with his first official visit to Moscow. The diplomatic relations were established between the USSR and the FRG at last. In the course of difficult talks, Adenauer managed to obtain an agreement of Soviet leaders to repatriate all of the German prisoners of war located in the USSR territory, including those sentenced by Soviet trials for war crimes and imprisoned for different times in prisons and camps. Soon the prisoners of the general's camp in Chertsey were read out the long-expected decree of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR about their pre-term release and return to the fatherland.
The paragraph was read by our general, the German translated into German. This all lasted for half an hour. Tables were prepared in the dining room with all food in special Moskovskaya and Stolichnaya. Next day after the celebrations, one group was sent, 30 men. The outfit was as the following. They threw off their own clothes completely. They were provided with warm balbriggan, shirt, suit of first rate, naturally. Light overcoat at that time with belt as per fashion. Box calf boots, felt hat. In other words, as delegation.
These people had stayed in the Soviet camps for more than 10 years. Nevertheless, they left our country without malice, offense, and irritation. They had just turned this page of their lives. Walter von Seydlitz left the USSR borders among the last. Sentenced more than 5 years in Soviet prisons, he returned to his home in Hamburg, where he lived to a very old age. He was considered as a traitor for a long time at home.
Historians are often accused of revising their opinions. But it is natural and cannot be another way. It is interesting how the public opinion is changing in West Germany. If at first the participants of the general's conspiracy dated July 20th were considered as criminals and figures of National Committee, Union of German Officers, were considered as traitors as well, then now most of the historians, in spite of different opinions, believe that they were national heroes, heroes of the resistance to Nazism.
Historians calculated that there were 403 generals of the Wehrmacht in Soviet captivity. 278 of them were released and returned home. 11 were delivered to other countries for trials. 24 were executed as war criminals. 105 died in captivity. The fate of 9 shall still be specified.